Welcome back to a continuation of our discussion of World War II. You'll recall we left off at the end of part one in September 1939 with Germany and Russia, or the Soviet Union, invading Poland and carving it up, which led to an immediate declaration of war by France and Germany. The German tactics in World War II on the ground were called the Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. In World War I, you'll recall, defense had all the advantages of the newest technologies then. Long-range artillery and machine guns. Now, however, thanks in part to new technological advances, the offense was much stronger with much improved airplanes, particularly dive bombers, which the Germans, as we saw a few minutes ago, had practiced with in the Spanish Civil War. And now we have paratroopers, many tens of thousands of soldiers jumping from airplanes with paratroops in surprise attacks. And we have tanks, which were first developed, as we saw in World War I. But now they're much stronger, have heavier armor, and bigger guns. And the German Blitzkrieg, or lightning strategy, was essentially move fast and paralyze the opponents. They could do that. They could move the tanks in quickly. They could send paratroopers in, and they could send dive bombers in. Well, after the invasion of Poland and Britain and France declared war, nothing really happened for 7 or 8 months. And this happened until May 1940, when Hitler invaded France and Belgium and the Netherlands, or Holland. And this period is called the Phony War. This is between September 1939 and the spring of 1940. There was a state of war, but nothing was happening. But then something did happen, very serious, in May 1940. Germany, using the Blitzkrieg tactic, quickly took over France in 6 weeks. And that was something it couldn't do in 4 years in World War I. You'll recall in World War I, the Germans never made it to Paris. They took over all of France in 6 weeks. And I won't go into detail here, but after World War I, the French started to be concerned about another German attack, and they built a very strong line of fortifications near the border with Germany called the Maginot Line. What the Germans did was quite clever. They went north of it. They went north of it through the countries of Belgium and Holland, or the Netherlands, and came around. And also, the Maginot Line did nothing to stop the paratroopers. Well, Hitler wanted to take symbolic revenge on the French people. So the French in May 1940 were required to surrender in exactly the same railroad car north of Paris where the Germans had surrendered in World War I. This was very, very symbolic for the German people. Here we have a photograph. This is the French delegation in the front entering the railroad car. And again, Hitler managed to find the very same railroad car where the Germans had surrendered to France at the end of World War I. Well, the Germans marched triumphantly into Paris. They wanted to humiliate the French people even more. So they entered Paris through the Arc de Triomphe, which you see in the background. And if you've been to Paris, you've undoubtedly seen it. It's right now they're on the famous Champs-Élysées. And here we have a picture of Hitler, who very quickly visited Paris. And this is a photo opportunity um, in front of the Eiffel Tower, obviously. And on top of the Eiffel Tower, you can't see it in this photograph, there's a very, very large German flag with a swastika on it to try, and there were German swastikas all over Paris and all over France to remind the French people who was in charge. And of course, the Germans occupied France for a little over 4 years until after the D-Day landings. We'll talk about that later. And a very brutal, brutal occupation of France. So now in Western Europe, Britain was alone in facing Germany. The country of Ireland, which you recall had achieved independence right at the end of World War I, declared itself neutral. Some other countries like Switzerland and Spain and Portugal declared themselves neutral. So the only country now in Europe facing Germany was a small island country of Britain. Well, Franklin Roosevelt and Congress's response was, we're not going to send any troops. We're only going to send military supplies and food. And Franklin Roosevelt made a famous radio address in which he used the analogy of, well, Britain is our friend. We have many of the same values. And he said, it's like what happens if your neighbor's house is on fire? Would you lend your neighbor your garden hose to help him put out the house fire? And then Roosevelt said, we're going to give all aid short of war, short of sending U.S. troops or declaring war. And also said the U.S. would be the great arsenal of democracy, as it had done in World War I. So just like in World War I, before the U.S. became involved, in World War II, before the U.S. became a combatant, U.S. factories greatly increased production of war materiel, everything from tanks to rifles to bullets, airplanes, and would ship those to Britain. And as we saw when we discussed the Great Depression, this greatly increased industrial production was a major factor in ending the Depression. Well, Charles Lindbergh and Herbert Hoover were among the many, many isolationists who opposed such assistance. I already spoke about Charles Lindbergh, and hopefully you've already seen his brief video. And Herbert Hoover, a Republican, felt that, the U.S. simply should not get involved. Well, in 1940, Franklin Roosevelt was reelected for a third term. The U.S. Constitution had not yet been amended to prohibit more than 2 terms. That happened later. And he wanted the votes of many of the isolationists. Franklin Roosevelt strongly supported Britain's cause. He didn't want to see Britain defeated, but he realized he would not be elected taking too strong a pro-British stance. So he made a famous campaign speech in which he said, your boys are not going to be sent in any foreign wars. Now, Britain is standing there alone. And so remember, in May, in June, France was taken over, 1939. It should be 1940. And over the next few months, the Germans planned to invade Britain, send a large force across the English Channel, and invade and take over Britain. And so to soften up Britain, the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, engaged in massive bombing campaign. They didn't have to go very far. They had bases now right in France. It wasn't very far. So at first they were bombing the British Air Force, or RAF, bases. And then they accidentally bombed London because a pilot's navigation was off. and causing massive casualties. This enraged the British, who then sent some bombers over and bombed Germany. And then Hitler decided to engage in massive bombing of British cities on the mistaken theory that the British public would rise up and demand that Britain seek a peace treaty with Germany because of the suffering. So his real goal was to Hitler's goal was to destroy the British Air Force, but the RAF. But fascinating story is what allowed the RAF to survive was the radar, which was a secret. The Germans didn't really know that the British had such an effective radar. They were trying to develop their own at this time. And the Royal Air Force was decimated. It had relatively few planes and pilots, but every time Germany sent bombers over, they were met with British fighters. And so the Germans assumed the British had more fighters than they really did. Why? Because of radar, the British could see the German fighters coming over, and they could quickly send some fighters up to attack the German planes. Then was the Blitz, was the massive bombing of London and other cities, not just London, other cities. And Hitler again hoped that the British people would just give up and force the government to sue for peace. About 1 million homes were destroyed. Incredible. Both my parents were British. My father was actually in the Royal Air Force during World War II. He was not a pilot, but he was part of the operation running the radar system. And my mother lived in London. My mother slept like this in London during this period of time. These are the subway, or what the British call the underground stations. They would turn the electricity off on the tracks. People would go in with newspapers as their blankets. They would lay down and spend the nights there, and they would hear the bombs up above, and they'd go up above, and perhaps their building was bombed, perhaps not. Some people felt it was too much hassle, uncomfortable to sleep underground, and many people died for that reason. They also had shelters that were built as shelters, but they didn't have time to build them, and the underground stations were there. Well, as I mentioned, this massive bombing of civilian populations did not demoralize the British people, but they became more determined than ever to defeat Hitler. And during this period of time, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister, became the symbol of British determination to stop Hitler. He was a very gifted orator, master of the English language, and I've put two very brief videos in the module. They're about 2 minutes long, and these are excerpts from two of his finest speeches. One is called Our Finest Hour, and the other is Fighting on the Beaches, in which he said 100 years from now, people will look back and say this is the finest hour of the British Empire. And the Fighting on the Beaches speech talks about, well, they knew the Germans were planning to invade. When they invade, we'll fight them on the beaches, we'll fight them in the fields, we'll fight them everywhere, we'll fight them until we die. They're very stirring speeches. So I encourage you to watch them. They're each about 2-minute segments. Well, what happened there was Hitler was not able to defeat the Royal Air Force. And for that reason, he had to postpone his planned invasion of Britain, because he'd planned to invade in September, then October, and then he didn't want to invade when the English Channel water became too rough, when winter started. So now let's move to Russia. In summer of 1941, you recall Russia, or Soviet Union, had engaged in 1939 in an agreement, a pact with Hitler, and they had together invaded Poland and carved it up. Well, rather unexpectedly, Hitler invaded Russia with a massive, massive number of troops. And his goal was to destroy communism. As I mentioned earlier, he hated communists. He hated what he called, the Bolsheviks. The Russians were not prepared. The German forces made major advances until the fall and then the winter. They had planned to take Moscow and the major cities by the winter, but they hadn't been able to. Their forces got bogged down in the great, harsh Russian winter, and they suffered massive casualties, and they were forced to retreat. Well, during this campaign, the German forces were ruthless and brutal to the Russian people, and there were many atrocities committed, and with the result, as we'll see later, when the Russians invaded Germany, they reciprocated and committed many atrocities. Now, Hitler's invasion of Russia is considered by most historians his major mistake of the war. He had long supply lines. His troops were going deep into Russia, a huge country, and then they could not move quickly enough, and they were caught by a brutal Russian winter. Hitler and the generals had been so confident of a quick victory that they had not even given the soldiers adequate winter clothing. And so the Germans continued fighting the Russians on the so-called Eastern Front until the very end of the war in 1945. And during this period, from the summer of 1941 invasion until the end of the war, 4 years, the Germans always had at least 2/3 of their troops fighting Russia. And these were their best troops. The troops that Hitler put on the Western Front to defend France and all were generally the older troops. They weren't the best troops. So the elite troops were always fighting Russia. And in fact, 90% of the Germans who were killed in World War II were killed by the Russians. We often don't look at that sufficiently when we're looking at it, studying it in the United States or Britain, but those are the harsh facts of the war. Now, after Hitler's surprise attack of Russia, the US and Britain sent aid to Russia, even though the US and Britain did not like the communist government. They felt that their first priority was to defeat Germany, so they sent military aid. And as I mentioned before, the Germans never reached Moscow because they got bogged down in the extreme cold. Now let's turn finally to the U.S. getting involved. What had happened in July 1941, about 6 months before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt stopped oil exports to Japan, because Roosevelt and Congress did not approve of Japanese aggression, and they in Asia, and so they wanted to try and reduce the amount of oil available to Japan. And also the Panama Canal, which was owned by the United States at that time, was closed to any vessels going to or from Japan. Now, for its part, Japan thought it could knock the United States out of a Pacific war with one big blow, causing it to withdraw from the Pacific and leave Japan alone. Japan never had the intention of invading the United States and taking over the United States. And the last thing Japan wanted was a long, protracted war against the United States, which was a much larger economy and military machine. And behind all this, the Japanese felt the United States was a soft country since it was a democracy. Well, as you all know, on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese group of aircraft carriers approached Hawaii and launched a complete surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, causing massive damage. And I've put a very short 2-minute video in the module of Franklin Delano Roosevelt speaking before Congress the next day and asking Congress to declare war on Japan in retaliation for this attack. Hawaii, of course, in 1941 was not a state. It did not become a state till the 1950s, but it was a U.S. territory, and this was a large U.S. naval force, the U.S. Headquartered there. Fortunately for the United States, all of the aircraft carriers and submarines were out of port in training exercises. The Japanese had some spies in Hawaii who had been observing the port, but they had not been able to send that crucial information back to Japan. And for Americans, what was particularly bad about this attack, it was a, quote, sneak attack. The Japanese had not declared war and then attacked, but rather, without declaring war, had attacked the United States. In fact, at the very same time the attack occurred, for a number of days, the Japanese ambassador in Washington had been trying to negotiate with the United States government. And so it was viewed as, sort of not following the correct rules or ethics, if you will. In fact, a declaration of war had been sent from Tokyo to the Japanese embassy in Washington, and they'd asked the Japanese ambassador to deliver it the morning of the attack, but by the time the Japanese embassy decoded the transmission, the attack had already taken place. So this aspect of a sneak attack really influenced U.S. attitudes towards Japan for many, many years. I remember back in the 1980s when Americans first started buying Japanese cars in any volume. I mean, originally, products from Japan were considered cheap and tinny and, not worth anything. Then the Japanese started producing really high quality cars, which many Americans found more reliable than the cars produced by American manufacturers. And there was a lot of opposition to buying cars made in Japan because they'd been made by the country that had had a sneak attack. And I remember large stores, like if you worked for a Target or a large store, and if you were an employee and you drove a Japanese car, you were required to park it at the far end of the parking lot because they didn't want it near the store rather. So this is the actual military report, air raid on Pearl Harbor, X, which is like a period. This is no drill. And this was sent out to all the ships. This was from the commander in Honolulu. Well, needless to say, there was a strong and immediate reaction in the United States. This is the San Antonio Express, Japs butcher Americans. Here we have the New York Times. Make sudden attack on Hawaii. Heavy fighting at sea reported. At the same time as attacking Pearl Harbor, within hours, Japanese also attacked U.S. military bases in the Philippines and elsewhere in Asia. Let's look briefly at the home front. Many women, as of World War I, now served in non-combat military jobs. And because so many men had been called up to go abroad in the military, about 10 million women left their homes and entered traditional male jobs, largely in factories. This is a famous poster from the time, Rosie the Riveter. This woman with her scarf on her head, a blue shirt, which symbolized working in a factory. We still use the term blue collar workers. Those are people who used to wear blue shirts so they wouldn't get the grease wouldn't be so obvious. And a riveter, in case you don't know what a rivet is, it's a piece of hot iron or steel. It's heated up and it's used to connect large pieces of metal in buildings. So this was put out by the government to encourage women and telling them yes, they could do it. African Americans, just like in World War I, many left the South for jobs in the North or West to work in factories. Quite a few went to Washington, D.C., also to work in expanded government offices. About 1 million African Americans or blacks served in the military in segregated non-combat units. And then near the end of the war, they were doing some combat. And then Eleanor Roosevelt was pressuring her husband for black volunteers fighting in Europe. There were also about 600 black pilots who served with distinction. Mexican Americans, well, just like there was a shortage of men in the factories because of the war, there was also a shortage of men to work in the fields, particularly during the harvest time in California, Texas, and across the country. So an agreement was signed between the U.S. and Mexico governments setting up a program for farm workers to come into the United States on one-year contracts. This was called the Bracero Program. If you've studied Spanish, you know brazo means arm. So the idea was these people would do manual labor to help the United States. And they came in totally legally on a one-year contract. They paid Social Security contributions. And in fact, after they'd worked a certain number of years, they would receive Social Security. This program was considered highly successful. It in effect, regulated the need for workers, so people didn't have to come over illegally. They could come over under the contract. If someone from Mexico felt that the contract was being violated, they had every right to go and make a formal legal complaint. The program lasted into the 1960s, about 20 years past World War II. And everybody, the workers were content with it. The farmers were content with it. The ranchers were content. But American labor unions opposed it because they said, these foreign workers are willing to work for less pay than, Americans. Therefore, they put pressure on Congress to end it. There were roughly 300,000. At the time, virtually all Hispanics in the U.S. were from Mexico. Mexican Americans or Hispanics in the military. And several did win Congressional Medals of Honor in combat. Looking now at the Native Americans or Indians, unlike the blacks, they were integrated into regular white units. So they served in regular units. But you may have heard this before, the so-called code talkers, they came up with a system where they used Indians, especially Navajos, who could speak messages during the fighting largely in the Pacific, somewhat against Germany also. And these messages were somewhat encoded. For instance, they wouldn't say gun, they'd use some other word for gun, but they spoke in the Navajo language. And the Germans and Japanese were listening to these conversations, and they wanted to break the code, but they knew it was some language, but they could never figure it out. So it was a highly, highly successful effort using the so-called code talkers. Here's a photo from the Pacific with this Navajo speaking to another Navajo somewhere else on the island. They were attacking, and when the Japanese could hear the broadcast, there was no way they could decipher it. And finally, here in part 2, I'd just like to talk briefly about what happened to the Japanese Americans living in California. There was an invasion scare in California. There was great panic that the Japanese might invade California or attack California, as they had, of course, in Hawaii in December. Well, in February 1942, a couple months after Pearl Harbor, a Japanese submarine went about 1 mile offshore, surfaced off of Santa Barbara, California, which is like 70 or 80 miles north of Los Angeles, and fired its 5-inch gun, about 25 or 30 shells, at a oil refinery along the coast there. The attack itself did relatively little damage. I think 1 or 2 pumps were blown up. But people on the shore could look out and see the silhouette of the Japanese sub, and then the Japanese sub submerged and went off. This caused absolute panic, not only in California, but in the United States, that, the war was coming to the United States. Remember, World War I had not gone to U.S. Continental territory. Hawaii was a long way away. Many Americans were killed, but it was not part of the continental U.S. Excuse me, here was an attack on the continental part of the United States. There's a 5 or 6 minute video in the module, which is worth watching. And what the immediate impact, it led to a real panic. My God, there must be Japanese spies here in California. How would they know where the refinery is, et cetera, et cetera? It turned out later, after the war, they found out that the captain of that submarine had actually studied in California in a university in Los Angeles. And that's how come he knew where the oil refinery was. So there was a great fear that there were spies among all the Japanese Americans. This sort of combined with racism against Japanese, Asians, as we've seen earlier in the course. So internment camps were set up. These were prisons, basically, for all people in California of Japanese ancestry, including American citizens. And this was done because the government said, well, we don't have time to really investigate and find the spies. There must be spies among them. Otherwise, how would they be attacking our oil refinery? And look at what happened anyway in Pearl Harbor. So they were told to assemble. They were given relatively little time to sell their property. Many of the Japanese had small farms or stores. And of course, the whites were more than eager to move in and buy their farms at less than market value. And then they were bused to internment camps, not in California largely, but there actually were several internment camps for Japanese in Texas. These were only Japanese who lived in California, and they were there. There was barbed wire around them. They lived in, there's actually an article in the media that talks about it. They were not really concentration camps. I remember in college I read a book, it was entitled Concentration Camps USA, about this. I don't think that's a fair title, because in World War II particularly, the word concentration camp means something entirely different. Concentration camps, we'll see in the next lecture, are where the Germans sent people to be exterminated. Well, the Japanese Americans were imprisoned, but they weren't exterminated, obviously. Now, at the time, this action was strongly supported by both political parties, by the media, the public, and the United States Supreme Court. A case went from a U.S. citizen of Japanese ancestry, and the Supreme Court upheld the ruling. Might note at the same time, in Canada, there was also a great fear of Japanese spies and an attack. So Canada moved all Japanese and prevented them from moving within 10 miles of the coast. It did not put them in internment camps. It's interesting that in Hawaii, where about a third of the population was Japanese ancestry. And there had been active spies. In fact, there was documentary evidence that they had been reporting to the Japanese consulate there. There was no internment of Japanese in Hawaii. And of course, Hawaii had been attacked in Pearl Harbor. Probably because it was just 1/3 of the population, they couldn't do it. This was clearly a massive violation of civil rights. The U.S. Congress in 1988, both political parties agreed that this had been a violation of civil rights of the Japanese population in California because it wasn't selective. It was just everybody of that ancestry went off to an internment camp for 4.5 years. And then restitution was paid in 1988. And it was a token amount, I think it was $20,000 for anyone who was still living who had been interned in those camps. At the same time, many Japanese American men were drafted or forced to serve in the military in combat in Europe, where they excelled in combat, or work as translators in the Pacific area. Japanese is a very, very difficult language, and so it was obviously useful to have people with a native command of it serve as translators. And finally, just to end off part 2, I might mention that during World War II, about 11,000 Germans and some Italians were also interned, but it was done on an individual basis. There were many, many millions of Americans in the United States of German ancestry as well as Italian ancestry. They weren't all just rounded up and put in internment camps, as happened to the Japanese, but rather it was done on the basis largely if people were members of the American Nazi Party, or there was suspicion of perhaps espionage. And finally, about 5,000 Germans living in Latin America within 1,000 miles of the Panama Canal were either interned in the United States or in jails in Latin American countries, which agreed with this policy. And the fear was here the Panama Canal, which is now owned and operated by Panama, but at that time was owned and operated by the United States. There was a great fear of sabotage. It would be relatively easy to, with explosives to shut down the Panama Canal for a period of time. And so they wanted to preclude that. And in fact, I remember when I was living in South America, I met a South American with a German last name, and I commented how his English was so good. And he said, oh yeah, he grew up as a little boy in an internment camp in Texas. I said, really? I didn't even know at that point they had interned Germans. He said, well, living in South America, he said, well, the policy at the time was we had to live, since we lived within 1,000 miles, we all had to go up in the camp. And I said, oh my God, what was it like? And he said, well, he was young. He was like 3 or 4 years old. And, he didn't have bad feelings of it. Obviously, his parents did, being forced to go and live in basically a prison. Okay, this is the end of part 2, and we will continue part 3. Thank you.